Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Madeline Carr. I'm a senior research fellow at RUSI and professor of global politics and cybersecurity at University College London in the Department of Computer Science. I want to welcome everyone to this event, which is the final installment in RUSI's Advanced Technology and Economic Resilience event series, which has brought together experts from government, industry, academia, and civil society to discuss and debate these really significant challenges and opportunities posed by technological innovation. There are a number of previous lectures which are available on the RUSI website, and I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at them because they've all been terrific. It's my real pleasure today to introduce our speaker for today's session, Professor Sir Anthony Finkelstein. He's a president of City University of London. He's also a professor of software systems engineering there, which is his disciplinary background, and I think he's going to feature in a really interesting way in his lecture today. Prior to taking up this current role, Professor Sir Anthony was Chief Scientific Advisor for National Security to the UK government from 2015 to 2021. It's quite a significant period. He's also an elected Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. In 2009, he received the Oliver Lodge Medal from the IET for achievement in information technology. And he was also appointed CBE in the 2016 birthday honors for services to computer science and engineering. In the 2022 New Year public honors, New Year honors, he was knighted for his public service. So really a career of extraordinary achievement, and someone who's been working in this space and thinking deeply about this intersection between digital technologies, emerging technologies, scientific innovation, and international security for a long time. His speech today is on the record. It will be followed by a discussion between the two of us and a Q&A, which will be off the record, just to allow for a little bit more free speech between us all. If you would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A function, not the chat function, and those will come through to us for discussion. Really looking forward to this. I'd like to now invite you, Anthony, to make your remarks.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Madeline. It's always strange to hear oneself introduced formally, and it's a struggle to recognize oneself amidst the various appointed to, was for some time, etc. Of course, the one thing you didn't say was that I was a long-standing professor of computer science at UCL, and very proud to say so. And much of what you'll hear is conceptually made during that period. So perhaps we have that in common as a starter. So the title of the talk is Made in Britain or Made Insecure, but I'm going to take a very broad approach to talking about the intersection of science, technology, geopolitics, and international trade, an exceptionally complex arena. Each is a rapidly changing domain, and it's difficult to make confident assertions of principle, though being a professor, I fully intend to chance my arm, and I trust that you're going to apply the relevant caveats to what I'm about to say. Now, if I'm to do this properly, I need to set out an analytical framework that I hope you'll find useful. I'm then going to take that analytical framework and look at some examples of where we have made and will need to make policy judgments. I'm going to talk a little bit about China and, to a certain limited extent, the the United States, because I don't think you can have this discussion without it. It's a necessary context. I'm going to draw some conclusions with respect to the situation we now face and make some proposals as to how this situation might be addressed. My background is, as Madeline alluded to, in systems engineering, and I have a strong tendency to view matters through that lens. And I'm going to crave the indulgence of those of you with a security or geopolitical background who are less interested in this form of analysis. But I'm going to argue that it is, I think, particularly helpful and appropriate to the problems we face. Most technological products, then, can be thought of as systems. That is, they are comprised of interacting parts, subsystems, themselves composites of interacting parts, and as a collective, they perform functions. They perform functions and they behave. They operate in the context of, I think the best thing to say is, are embedded within overarching systems, some of sufficient complexity that they might be referred to as systems of systems. Systems engineers like myself generally tend to represent these systems as networks, or technically graphs, comprised of elements and interactions or dependencies amongst those elements, variously graphically presented. You'll have seen networks and blocks and arrows and what have you. I also think it's helpful in this context to think of these graphs in terms of layers. Thus, we have a network representing a product, the development system for the product, a network representing the system of supply of components and resources, call it a supply chain, a network representing the system of knowledge assets, each interdependent upon which the development is based, standards, know-how, and the like, a further network of economic and financial transactions. So we have a whole series of these interlocking layered networks with vertical relationships between the layers. All of this gets extremely complex very quickly, with multiple layers, dependencies between layers, embeddings, and so on. We can add to this the idea of services and platforms, which adds yet further complexity. If you want an example, a telecommunication switching system is actually a pretty good illustration, and in fact will come in handy later when we talk about telecommunications specifically. So a telecommunications system is a complex system composed of multi-component subsystems, technologically heterogeneous, the product of a complex development and component supply system, and dependent upon a complicated network of standards, know-how, prototype implementations, and other knowledge assets. The telecommunications system is embedded in a larger critical national infrastructure system, enabling communications and business services and emergencies services and response and so on. Now, systems of this kind exhibit important properties. I'd like, if I, in the ideal situation, I would have liked to discuss how these properties arise, but I've got limited time, and I suspect on some of your parts, limited patience. These properties include robustness, fragility, sensitivity, and critical dependencies. The dynamic and temporal characteristics, how they unfold in time, are also of particular significance. They include feedback, control, stability, and responsiveness. Highly functionally optimized systems are also often very fragile, sensitive, susceptible to the failure of these critical dependencies. We are societally highly reliant upon the operation of complex technological systems and products. Indeed, actually, we're highly reliant upon even relatively simple products and services, resting on complex infrastructure, systems, and processes, delivered by way of even more complex supply chains, and again, resting on further complex logistic systems. Thus, okay, for all this rather abstract analysis, you knew where we would end up. National security, to include societal resilience and economic security, is bound up with the design of complex systems and with their associated supply chains. So, having set that out and given you an idea about how I think about this challenge, I'd like to set out some initial principles. I'm going to revisit them a little bit at the end of these remarks. First, the design of a complex system and assurance of its properties cannot be undertaken absent the explicit design of the supply chain associated with it. So, in other words, when you design a system, technological system, and you seek to assure its properties, you need at the same time to design the supply chain and secure assurance about the overall properties of that supply chain. So this actually suggests a new set of system design approaches are going to be needed to assist with that. This is a chain of quite fundamental change in perspective. Second principle, and this I think is probably one of the most contentious things that I might say in these remarks. We are unlikely ever to be able to escape highly optimized, lean, just-in-time global supply chains with their associated fragilities. Nor, should I say, would we necessarily want to, with some narrow exceptions, which we should discuss. And that business of saying highly optimized, lean, just-in-time global supply chains, fragile as they are with us, and probably for good, in both senses of that. This has consequences that I intend to set out. So far, so abstract, really. I'd like to consider some of the most obvious examples which have set the tenor of the policy discussions around these issues. Telecommunications equipment, and of course, Huawei. Semiconductors, critical materials, read critical minerals, and medical equipment and supplies. Each of these has given rise to their own set of considerations. And I think it's fair to observe that there's no coherence to the collective discussion, a matter that actually I'm intending to address. So actually these discussions have been held in a rather disjoint way. And of course, the technologies we're discussing, technologies are profoundly different. And the way we've reached our current position and the position we might reach is different. That doesn't mean that there aren't important commonalities. Of course, there are. So, telecommunication systems. Yes, Huawei. In this case, we lacked at the relevant period proper technological foresight. We allowed disaggregated commercial decision-making to leave us with a set of systemic vulnerabilities to our critical national infrastructure systems arising from the domination of the supply chain for key technology components. Furthermore, the choices we made led to a more tightly coupled system, one in which the interdependencies were stronger, that was very vulnerable to disruption. We then, post hoc, made mitigations to these vulnerabilities, essentially system design choices, and some controls we applied to the development processes of these technologies. And these were sensible choices, successful within a particular design paradigm, that is the design paradigm for the past generation of telecommunication systems, but which we now know are no longer valid with the next technology generation. Now, a range of options are currently in play to address the situation. The most interesting, and I believe the most strategically acute, is to use a careful combination of open source development and componentization or delayering to provide a more robust telecommunications system architecture and a more robust and more dynamic commercial ecology. Semiconductors present a far more challenging situation. I probably should take a side moment to say that a lot of the discussion on technology and supply chains often starts by talking about semiconductors. And I remain somewhat concerned that, in fact, that semiconductors are a bit of a special case, and that drawing very general conclusions from that specific technology may be problematic. But in any event, here we have a hyper-complex, tightly integrated product and associated supply chains, development processes, and knowledge systems, exhibiting a vast number of close dependencies. This is a situation that arose out of a confluence of technology, geopolitics, actually, some of which had to do with a historical situation about addressing supply chain imbalances. It's the result of economics, and in part the result of technological happenstance. It's evolved over 60 plus years, but the situation has clearly delivered us with some very serious global vulnerabilities, and it's uncertain how this might be addressed. The development of UK-based, the development of US-based silicon fabrication to provide an allied source of supply is one emerging direction. Stockpiling is a simple but obviously limited strategic option. Developing a unique niche for the UK, for example, in areas such as silicon photonics or similar, so that we can play into the broader ecosystem, may be worthwhile, but does not of itself eliminate the underlying vulnerability. Critical materials is the most diverse area, and it may be that a single critical material strategy doesn't make much sense, and we actually have to have a range of strategies suitable to context. Many of our critical materials challenges arise from the hard economics of extraction combined with a deliberate strategy by China to hold a position across these materials. This strategy is probably partly intended to secure its own manufacturing base, partly an opportunity to secure a strategic economic and political advantage that can be exploited. Allied supply, collaboration, and stockpiling are reasonable responses. A determined attempt to push back on Chinese debt hegemony and on their ability to corner markets in Africa and other areas, using the UK's finance capabilities will be important. Smart process engineering and increasingly green and recyclable production will likely be one of the most effective tools, and perhaps a very specific UK opportunity. I'd like, by the way, at this point, just to call out what I think is some pretty good UK policy work on critical minerals that's been done. I think the critical minerals strategy report reads well, and I'm assuming that if you're at this lecture, you're interested in that, so I certainly commend it to you. Finally, and my final example is medical equipment and the situation revealed by shortages during the pandemic. Setting aside the question of national preparedness and whether we should have had stockpiles, with a view to risks that were, after all, on our national risk register, or possibly even at the edge, a sovereign vaccine production capability. The idea that we might be able to wholly insulate ourselves from global supply chains across the vast range of different products, from PPE to ventilators, is just untenable. And some people on this call may have heard me joke, the idea that we're going to be producing paracetamol in Merthyr Tydfil. It's just laughable. And so we're really going to have to start thinking more holistically about how we do that. In fact, it seems to me that medical equipment is actually by far the best test case for forming a broader policy response. And in my conclusion to these remarks, I'll suggest a little bit about what this might look like. Now, clearly, there are some areas where we need sovereign supply. Our ability to maintain our sovereign intelligence capability, to include sovereign crypt and collection assets, our sovereign deterrent, is also an area where we'd want to ensure, to the extent possible, end-to-end control. But where the boundary for this exactly lies is a question that can be open to a range of views. Other areas enabling independent military operation fall within this grey zone. I'm not clear that many of our critical national systems or capability to respond to national risks require sovereign supply. Again, this is to be distinguished from the need for planning and preparedness. It is not clear to me, even in the extreme case of the pandemic, that we saw wholesale and sustained failure in global supply chains, that we experienced serious disruption, for sure. An interesting question in this regard relates to climate change and the possibilities of consequent longer-term global-scale disruptions. This is a case where a combination of high-quality policy and scientific work is, I believe, necessary. In any case, the important thing to keep in mind is that any step away from highly optimized supply chains entails long-term and short-term costs. And the costs of disruption and similar may be ultimately economically easier to sustain. This is a hard discussion to have. Now, no discussion of this topic can properly be held without a serious consideration of China. The economic strength of China and our dependence upon its manufacturing capability lies at the heart of the difficult choices we need to make. And at this point, I need to depart somewhat from my primary expertise to make some foreign policy observations. We are all too frequently discussing what I would term second-order policy issues in the absence of a clear diplomatic and foreign policy stance in respect of China. I understand that this is politically contested. I understand that this presents difficulties in terms of pushback from China, and we've seen this in the more exposed case of Australia and the Pacific. Nevertheless, I cannot see any option. This means setting out very clearly and consistently signaling what we realistically want from China. I want to state my personal position clearly. China is a communist state, dominated by its party apparatus. We do not share its values or its goals. These values are inimical to freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. We do, of course, recognize their sovereignty and are realistic about our ability to constrain their actions. We cannot form sustainable or trusted relationships with such a state, or the tools of that state, its industries and institutions. We should not ever believe that this is possible or allow us allow ourselves to slide into the language of partnership. We can, however, align interests and develop transactional relationships that are mutually highly beneficial. Most economic and trading relationships fall squarely into this category. This is not perhaps the best forum to speak about our broader expectations for China in areas such as human rights, regional security, and so on. I will not speak about Xinjiang, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. Oh, we may talk about Taiwan later, I guess, in questions. I will leave those things for other RUSI experts. Let's focus on instead the key issues of economic security. We are sanguine that the Chinese state will use economic leverage and access to promote its interests and must manage ourselves accordingly. But we do not expect the Chinese state to explicitly engineer arrangements to secure economic leverage on behalf and political leverage on behalf of the state. We must recognize reluctantly debt hegemony, though we must both contest it and call it out. A strategy that aims to dominate critical economic capabilities with a view to geostrategic advantage as distinct from prosperity is unacceptable. We do not expect that China will use the tools of the state to support wholesale economic espionage and stealing of intellectual property. Similarly, we do not expect them to subvert international standards or seek to bend technologies to their ideological ends. We expect them to work in concert with other global players around the economic dimensions of climate change and other global threats. There is more, clearly, but my principal point is that a secure and appropriately bounded economic and trading relationship is built upon clear expectations that need to be explicitly set out. The most meaningful act on the part of the UK that will enable secure supply chains and technological advance, is actually an HMG China policy. We now should turn to the United States, our ally, our partner, our friend. Alignment is critical, and this entails us understanding that our economic and competitive interests are not always aligned. The US acts fairly and appropriately in its own interests, but it is not always in the UK's interests, to illustrate, that US digital platforms form quasi-monopolies. US economic power, exercised through export controls and similar, is a blunt instrument, and we must ask that we are engaged with collaboratively. A trading nation such as the UK, operating outside the larger trading blocs, must maintain some flexibility and freedom of action. That being said, we should co-design our supply chains alongside the US, deepen and reinforce our political and economic ties, and consciously work to develop balancing capabilities to assure the mutuality of the special relationship. It has been suggested that we are on a journey to a division and to the creation of two distinct technological domains, one dominated by China and Chinese technical standards and models, the other by the US. Essentially a model of partitioned supply chains. This is plausible, but ultimately I do not think it is correct. It forgets the vast swathe of states and economies that are unaligned, who cannot afford to make economically disadvantageous choices, or who do not wish to build dependencies one way or another. I think in any event, the knowledge system, the system underpinning science, research, and innovation, is too closely coupled. This being said, it makes sense to be alive to the possibility that disjoint technologies and economic networks could emerge. So now, I'm going to shift to some prescriptions. What I think we should do. I start with reasserting my earlier position. There is no way back from highly optimized, lean, just-in-time globalized supply chains, even if such a retreat was the right thing to do. Certainly, such a strategy is poorly aligned with the UK's position as an agile global trading nation with science and technology superpower ambitions. Well, what does that mean? We need to switch our stance away from, I believe, the very narrow position on protecting critical national infrastructure to an idea that we are instead managing critical national systems. A more secure UK requires a focus on system resilience rather than point protection. This demands that we map, model, and analyze these systems and understand their sensitivities, critical dependencies, response to shock. In particular, we can look for hidden control loops and timing dependencies that can be difficult to discern outside a more systematic approach. And if that were unclear, I think you should probably turn to a lot of the work that we did during the pandemic and during the early stages of looking at Brexit preparedness, where we started to understand that many of the dependencies, systems, and ways in which things fed back were far from clear, and that many of the problems arose from that. Such the activity of mapping, modeling, and analyzing might reasonably be thought of as building, as it were, a digital twin of our critical national systems. Now, the term digital twin has become, unfortunately, loaded, but what I envisage is actually our ability to have a model and to gather real-time dynamic data to refine our understanding of our vulnerabilities and develop an anticipatory critical national systems capability. I gently suggest that this might require quite a change in the approach and capabilities across those concerned with the area. We need vastly better science, technology, and innovation intelligence. Our overall understanding of the global advanced technology scene at a national level remains poor, despite valuable efforts directed to improving the situation. Our international capability in this regard is, and I'm, with some exceptions, and bracket some of my best friends, etc., it is under strength and poorly directed. In general, supply chain intelligence and analysis is needed at a strategic national level. This requires urgent attention. it's possible to mitigate some of the risks. Such mitigations can occur in each and all of the layers of the system. Thus, the way in which we embed technologies within our critical national infrastructure, the design of those technologies, the way those technologies are developed, the configuration of the supply chain, the related knowledge assets. The range of strategies is extensive and includes building robust critical national systems, developing componentized systems with explicit interfaces that support substitutions, partitioned and redundant supply chains, driving open standards and shaping the playing field in which those standards are derived. An important protection for the UK is to ensure that whilst we may not be in control of all or indeed any of the system layers, we must retain the critical skills to understand and intervene. Though we might not retain a sovereign design or manufacturing capacity, we must retain an ability to understand our position and to create optionality. I would propose we need now a national critical skills strategy to ensure we retain a residual UK skills capability across a broad range of areas where we may not retain a significant presence in any of the other areas. Finally, the UK has a powerful and skilled financial sector that can form a valuable conduit for anticipatory supply chain intelligence and can also be used to position the UK in key sectors. We can do a better job of engaging with the finance and investment communities on the range of issues I have set out. So, to conclude, the challenges we face at this intersection of science, technology, geopolitics, and international trade are manifold. To address them, we need a grasp on systems and complexity enriched with anticipatory intelligence. We could, in the UK, develop our unique assets in this regard with consequent benefits for national security and for prosperity. Thank you, and back to you, Madeline.
Sorry, I'm not able to turn my camera on. I think there we go.
Ah.
There we are. There we are. We're all back. Thank you so much, Sir Anthony. I found that such an interesting and stimulating lecture, and I particularly appreciated you bringing an analytical framework from a different discipline into what's essentially international political economy or international relations. I think that there's such a lot of value in doing that, and I wish we were able to do that more. I think it's interesting you say that, because this is, of course, exactly the meeting point, because you've got somehow, in some senses, to encompass both the technical design of a product and the relationships between the parties that are that hold the capacity to develop them, are unified in that moment, and so it's a very interesting interdisciplinary meeting point. It is, and I think when you look at disciplines like international political economy or international relations, which have become a bit moribund in the context of emerging technology, that it's really worth doing what you've done to kind of break down that complexity and give us a way of thinking through these problems. I had a couple of questions that arose from that, and there are some questions coming in from the online participants. But you said earlier that you were talking about, I think, the Huawei case in specifics. You said that we made this point that we allowed this kind of disaggregated commercial decision making to leave us with this set of systemic vulnerabilities to our critical systems that arose from domination in the supply chain for key components. I mean, I wonder if you could comment, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, on how this could or should have been handled differently. So how did we end up in that situation, and how do we know that the next Huawei is not is not descending upon us?
Okay, so I mean that's for certain. I've been in the room with senior political figures saying, no more Huaweis. We don't want that to happen. To happen again. So, I mean, first let's for a moment say there were some things we did right. So I think once we realized the situation that was emerging, I think that the national security establishment and the telecommunications industry responded actually well to this, and the decisions to basically avoid placing Huawei in the switching core of our telecommunications infrastructure, and the steps that were taken for oversight of the development process. I think these were positive steps. What they clearly could not have taken account of was, one, that the technical game changed, and that the next generation of telecommunication standards looks radically different from the first. And the second is they could not have taken account of the emerging position of the United States in respect of these. Of Huawei and of telecommunications. So that we did some things, right, but we clearly did not have the broader technological intelligence that was necessary. I used intelligence in the broader sense that would have warned us of that, and we need to now develop that. There are some positive steps in this direction. We now have a National Science and Technology Council chaired by the Prime Minister. It's a massive step forward. We have the Office for Science and Technology Strategy, and with senior roles associated with that. That's a very important step forward. The Government Office for Science are now doing a much better job on technology foresight and analysis. Highly capable people doing that work, and I'm most impressed with their progress. But these are, I don't think the scale, scope, and so on of that work it is ready. I think our national security lens has turned more strongly towards science and technology, but there's an awful lot more to do. We really need a seriously, given the centrality of all of this to our national well-being in every regard, we cannot leave this. Things we need much better anticipatory intelligence.
Yeah, and a point that you made strongly. I think that's a call to action, really. Perhaps if I might, just one more question
Sure.
On the China issue, because in many ways, as you say, China and the US are the kind of context within which we operate, and I can maybe link this to one of the questions in the chat as well. I wondered if you could expand a little bit on what you feel is the right balance for the UK on a China policy. when you said that we should co-design our supply chains alongside the US to deepen and reinforce our political and economic ties, and really work consciously to develop these balancing capabilities to assure the mutuality of that relationship. Would you make any comment on whether our capacity to do this has been impacted positively or negatively, or perhaps both, by Brexit? And then a question that someone raised in the chat: would you give a score of 1 to 10 on the Prime Minister's recent Mansion House comments on the UK and China, in terms of how far that went towards the kind of UK-China policy that you feel we need?
Right, okay. The first thing to say is I'm relatively hard over on China, because I'm relatively hard over on liberalism and democratic values, and I guess, but as I said, I don't think that rules out healthy, vibrant, positive economic and trading relationships. I think those are essential. I am under no illusion that this sets China on a journey to democracy and liberalism, but I think it is in our collective interest to engage in those things. When it comes to critical national systems, a strong relationship with the US as a counterbalance and as a secure ally makes sense, and I think we ought to act. We ought to act accordingly. The Prime Minister's Mansion House speech, I thought was a very good. Speech. I think it was the clearest that we've been on a. I thought it moved further in the direction of a China policy than I've seen hitherto. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's a speech, and it has its limits. I was, in any event, I was already a very large meal and several glasses of Chablis into before I heard it. So that's that.
Fair enough. We'll take that caveat.
Conclusions.
Thank you very much. A couple of sort of integrated questions from the chat, Sir Anthony. First of all, which